Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm delighted to be joined by Katy, Mousinho and Giles, Lury, who will be presenting on a brighter, more equitable future, inspiring stories from inspiring leaders. In a moment, I'll pass over to Katy and Giles to start the webinar. But before I do, I'd just like to mention that today's webinar will feature a few polls and a Q&A section at the end. Therefore, we prompt you to send in your questions throughout the webinar, and please type these into the Q&A tab. We hope to answer all the questions at the end, but for any unanswered questions, do not worry. Katy and Giles have kindly agreed to reach out to you following the webinar. Just before I pass over to Katy and Giles, I'd just like to say that today's session is being recorded, and a copy of the recording will be sent to you all a week from today. So without further ado, I'll now pass over to Katy and Giles to begin the session. So to you guys.
Great. Thank you, Paul.
And good afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you are around the world in terms of different times. I think I must have learned by now that you're supposed to say welcome or something like that, because that covers all time zones.
Right, fantastic. I think we're just going to start off by introducing ourselves. So there's the pictures on the next chart, which Giles is in charge of the charts. So I think I'm going to introduce myself first, and I'm Katy Mousinho. And what Paul asked us to do was a little bit of a personal introduction on our background, our relevant experience, but as well as sort of our points of view, especially on the topic. So I'm going to start off telling you a little bit about me and my where I came from in terms of my career, because I was a modern language student in the 1970s, and the 1970s was the real era of women's lib. And I was the first in my family to go to university, and I truly believed that we had equal opportunity, at least in education. I felt everything was equal. It was great. I then got a great job in London, but it was at that stage that I began to realise that it wasn't quite the level playing field in the workplace. Yeah, it certainly was in education, but it was a bit different out there in business. However, I had a career in consumer insight that really took off in the 1980s. And this coincided with having a young family. So the thinking then really was that women could have it all. So we often talked about that. But actually, that meant working twice as hard, and is what is now known and now called the double shift. So you're having a career, you're raising a family, doing all the household chores. And there's been a lot about that in the news headlines recently. But it's interesting, at the time, I didn't really think about equality because I was doing well in my career. Everything seemed fine to me. I loved my job. I had a fantastic female boss I was working with. I had amazing clients such as Procter & Gamble, Unilever, British Airways, Lloyds Banking Group. So I was working with some amazing and inspiring people. My next move was into brand consultancy, which was a very natural step as it built on my insight expertise. So that's when I joined the Value Engineers. That's when I met Giles. So Giles and I have worked together for a long time. And I went in as the only female director, but ultimately I became MD. So, so lots of really positive things coming through there with my continuing to build my career. And throughout my career, I've worked with some amazing people, both colleagues and clients. And I've had both female and male bosses who have believed in me, who've mentored me and helped me to be the best that I possibly could be. So I feel very fortunate in that respect. I'm no longer full-time working, and I'm living a life of what I call freedom and flexibility. As I've forsaken the pressures of full-time working, but I'm still really busy on multiple activities, and especially those that I care about. Championing women in business is one of my real passions. So Giles actually came up with the idea for the book. So when he came up with that idea, he approached me, and I relished the opportunity at being able to really think about women in the workplace more, and specifically celebrating the successes of women, which we feel have been so underplayed over the years. The other thing that I love about having co-authored the book with Giles is that it's given us a platform to speak out, to challenge assumptions, to challenge the status quo, and to persuade other people to think differently about what's going on in the workplace and what's going on with leadership opportunities. So I really hope today's session will make you think a bit differently and want to inspire you to question a bit more. Giles, would you like to introduce yourself now?
Yeah, thanks. So as you can probably see from the words on there, I'm very brand centric in terms of my thinking, and have worked in branding in various shapes and forms for a long time. And in fact, the definition of myself on the right there, or the explanation of myself on the right, is a term I came up with some time ago called brandographics. You've probably heard of demographics and psychographics, but it is interesting that your choice of brand says an awful lot about you, as I think my choice of brand does. It says all sorts of things about both, you know, what I value, how I value, and certain quirky elements. And just in case you don't believe me, there is indeed the Lego watch that I have been proudly wearing now for some 20 odd years. I started in advertising, and I've worked in an awful lot of the marketing service companies, but have spent most of my time in brand consultancy, working on a variety of brands, and some absolutely fabulous ones, from Volkswagen to Heinz to Arla to Disney. So I, certainly have had a really enjoyable career. Interestingly, listening to Katy talk about her views on feminist values and how she saw the world, it is interesting that if I look back 10 years and how I viewed things, I think if I was asked, was I a feminist, I would have said, of course I am. Yes, women should have equal opportunities. And then if I was asked, did I think they have them? It was sort of like that. Yes, well, that's what that legislation's all been about and how things have been going. What was interesting is writing this book and exploring the topic is to find out the gap between that sort of very easy platitude that you can say and the reality of an awful lot of women's lives and careers, and learning about the differences. As Katy said, the book was my idea originally, though wouldn't be what it was without Katy. But that's probably the other side of what I do. I'm a scribbler. I love, as I've said, brands, and I'm a brand storyteller. I've collected lots of little stories about brands and their origins, their inputs, their impact on culture. I was just reading about how actually the notion of pay it forward was started at a Starbucks, when this woman just decided on a spur of the moment to buy not only her own coffee, but to pay for the person who was in the queue behind her coffee. And that went on for the next 11 hours before it was broken in terms of how that went forward. So I'm a great collector of stories, but this really came about, and our writing of this book came about because I had written 3 books and had about 250 brand stories published, normally little short stories. They're there in some of the other books I've written. They're generally under 1,000 words, and they make a little point about marketing. But in a conversation with one of my sons, who's a singer-songwriter, and we were talking about writing, and we were talking about women's perspectives, he asked me how many of those stories featured a woman as the lead character. And I said, that's a really interesting question. I've no idea. And I went away and did the research. And it turned out that only sort of like 20–25% out of those 250 actually had women as the key thing. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought how dominated marketing, literature, and the knowledge about it was actually dominated by men. So I decided I wanted to try and put that right. But I decided that I also needed more than a male's perspective. I needed a female's perspective too, if we're going to write this book sensibly. So I, surprise, surprise, went and talked to Katy, as someone who I thought would have really interesting views and thoughts about it. And indeed she did. And we agreed these 3 principles about what we wanted to try and get across in terms of, in the marketing context, the industry we knew best, though the book has had really good impact on a much broader field. It's all sorts of people have come forward and talked to us about elements, people not in marketing as well. So it's about celebrating women's success. It's about inspiring others and hopefully to build the confidence and the willingness to grow their talents going forward. So it was very much an element of that. And the book itself took shape. Originally, it was going to be a book of stories. Katy, however, said, wouldn't it be really good to talk to women nowadays and actually get their perspective, and brought the whole idea of doing some interviews with it. And we ended up splitting the book between stories, interviews, and our analysis of those interviews. And why then are we talking to you? Well, as I said, written by marketeers, but certainly we found it's got a much wider relevance across all areas of business, to men as well as to women. We found too many men who have my old attitude, who will sort of nod politely and go, oh yes, women deserve equality, but don't do much about it. It's been very well received by a number of leaders, business leaders and entrepreneurs who really feel that it's important. And actually, we think it is really something that people need to think about now. And some of the interviews we did were amongst probably your generation, and talk to people about them, about how they saw the future and the balance between men and women. So that's a little bit of background to me and the book. Katy, I don't know whether you want to add anything to that before moving on.
No, let's move on. So what we're going to be doing next is actually just talk to you about a couple of the stories. So as Giles said a moment ago, the book's structured in 3 parts. So the first part is about it's inspirational stories about women, and they range from the 1940s, for example, Brownie Wise, who was the Queen of Tupperware, through to the 21st century. So startups such as Propercorn, which was founded by somebody called Cassandra Stavru. And each of them is actually written in a style which is quite unique to Giles, and it makes them very easy and fun to read. So you can read them all very, very quickly. So, and you don't have to read the book cover to cover, which makes it just a very light, easy book to read. Then the second part is about our interviews with successful women in marketing, and that includes some very well-known names together with women you're unlikely to have ever heard of. And that's really by design. And we wanted to also encourage different thoughts, different perspectives, diversity, a broad range of ages. And we wanted to illustrate the changes over the decades. So what it was like in the 1980s starting work through to what it's like for millennials, and how, and to understand what the differences were. And then there's also women who are working in different sectors and different countries. So it's actually quite a broad perspective. And then finally, we've got what we call our thoughts and insights in a brave new world. So what does this mean for the future? And actually, that's particularly important for you and, and you coming out of business degrees and MBAs, because you're the future leaders in the workplace. Now, I'm going to talk you through just 2 of the stories, so quickly. And I'm going to talk you through the story about Natalie Molino Nino, who's actually an American, but of sort of South American descent. And the reason I want to talk about Natalie, because I didn't know about her beforehand. It was somebody that Giles knew about. And I was blown over when I heard Natalie's story. And in fact, Natalie's life would make a great movie. And I'm sure at some time somebody will pick it up. She's an amazing, multi-talented woman, a successful serial entrepreneur, an advocate for women, and an author. So loads of things. And it all started out when she was at college and she wanted to buy a car, but didn't have much in terms of the funds that she had. So she went to a car dealership and said, well, I'll pay half in cash and the other half I'll create you a website and trade. And they agreed. So She already had a job at the university's computer lab, so she'd learned how to code. But that's showing her entrepreneurial spirit at such a sort of young age. She built the website, she got lots of recommendations. She went on to build more websites. She launched her first tech startup at the age of 20. And then by her mid-30s, she'd already built 4 companies. So quite incredible that she did that. But then she changed direction because she did a course in theatre. And what she discovered, that what made her unique, especially in the world of engineers and techies, wasn't so much her technology expertise, but it was her storytelling. What she was really good at was creating narratives. She was the master, really, of the story and the soundbite, which made her really stand out, made her really different. So then that prompted a move into the world of investments, where she helped companies craft their stories. And this is sort of so relevant to, creating, brand purpose and brand philosophy. All of these elements really helped create her success. And now what she's doing, is actually, she's had a series of businesses that have been very successful, and particularly in the world of women-led businesses. But the big move for her was when she launched and became CEO of Bravo Investments. And we talk about this in the story quite a lot. And she had previously invested in women-led businesses because she was helping to try and create the level playing field by focusing on female entrepreneurs. But what she realized is that Bravo Investments was going to be really different. It wasn't about investing in female-led businesses. Rather, the premise was that she would like the business to invest in thing. And the premise is that the wealth of one female billionaire, or even a dozen of them, isn't going to magically trickle down and benefit the billions of women in the world who need it. But an investment in a female-owned company, sort of may make nice headlines. So we talk about sort of pretty pink headlines in the story, but it doesn't actually benefit women necessarily. So it could make one woman wealthy, but it could be a company that harms the environment and perpetuates workforce abuses. So is that really moving the dial for women? So Bravo invests in high growth companies that do things like pay their mostly female workforce living wages, gives women the benefits, especially in industries that rarely do. So think elderly care, childcare, domestic workers, food, all these sorts of companies. Finally, thing I want to say about her before I pass over to Giles is she's got really strong views on leadership. And there's a bit in the story which I think is really powerful, where she talks about herself. And, I'll actually just read you a bit from this because I think it's really, really interesting what she says about leadership. And she said, "A woman is most powerful when she allows herself to be supported. That's not something I've been good at. If you asked me a few years ago what I thought power was, I probably would have said it's about outcomes, getting shit done, leading people like herding cats, that kind of leadership. But I don't think this is the case anymore. Allowing yourself to be supported means you work in a team environment rather than using the top-down approach. You can be the one with the CEO title, but acting as part of a team rather than separate from it means you're not alone, and it helps you to accomplish even more." And I think that's something that's really powerful in the story, some really powerful thoughts. And also that's been supported by lots of the interviews and the people that we have been talking to. So fascinating story about Natalie. And I think Giles is now going to tell you the amazing story about Whitney Wolfe Herd.
Thanks, Katy. The story of Whitney Wolfe Herd, who you may well have heard of, is a really interesting story about strength, resilience, the ability to go on and to change things around and to do it in a better way for women, I think, in that. Whitney Wolfe Herd is again, one of those early joiners of interesting businesses. She joined Tinder as one of the very first sort of wave of people who did. And in fact, the name Tinder was her idea and came from lighting fires and that notion of lighting fires under a relationship. And actually some of its early success was very much based around her idea of the marketing strategy of focusing on college campuses. So she was a real success story there. But her story only lasted 2 years at Tinder before she left, suing for sexual harassment. Now, interestingly, it was settled. The rumors are it was settled for $1 million out of court, but she left under that cloud. And, you know, she talks about how difficult that was because she became a hate figure and actually really was bombarded by what she calls sort of the toxic masculinity, who really did sort of take to hounding her. And she sort of retreated away for a bit, sort of rethought about what she was doing, but decided she wanted to keep going in business and wanted to succeed and to take things forward. And she had a couple of other ideas, but didn't get any funding for them, and was encouraged by one of the venture capitalists to say, look, you do know about dating apps. Have you thought about going back and doing something different? And it really sort of struck her as being an interesting challenge because she'd been deliberately avoiding it. But she then thought up and said, well, actually, how do I do this differently? And the way that she talked about it was to try and say, can we stand it on its head? Can we put women in the driving force on a dating app? Because that wasn't what was done before. And the way she talked about it was, what would it be like if we made women make the first move? And that if they don't make that move, then the match disappears after 24 hours, like Cinderella. And it's a really interesting notion that you put the power into women's hand, and surprise, surprise, the venture capitalist who talked to her suddenly was really interested, and she got the backing and got to go forward and take and launch Bumble. Now, as we've seen already from before, she had a flair for marketing. And I think the little quote there is one of the original ads, you know, not playing the field, but leveling it. Another of the ads ran, be the CEO that your parents always wanted you to marry. She really did take this idea of standing the whole dating app idea on its head and set up what was ultimately a majority female executive team that built the Bumble business and then some of the other businesses as well, which is sort of the buzz, the networking for women ones. And Bumble has now got 40 million users and is the second largest dating site in the world, which is quite amazing when you think just how rough an experience she had first time round, and the strength, the resilience, and the intelligence and wit to stand that notion on its head and do it differently, I think is quite amazing in terms of what she achieved. And Katy, just a note on time, watching you and I, as ever, are talking far too much, and we probably speed up a little bit in terms of that. But Paul, if you would, if there's a first poll for you just popping up here in terms of what's coming up, and the idea of where do you think we are with gender equality in the workplace now? You know, is that equality being achieved? No, or maybe?
Yeah, so we've got the poll open, Katy and Giles. So we'll give it a few moments for everyone to answer, and then I'll be able to share the results with you both. Okay. Just to remind the audience, at the end there will be a Q&A section, so please keep typing in your questions in the Q&A tab, and hopefully we get a chance to answer them all. If we do run out of time, don't worry, these will get passed over to Katy and Giles to get in touch with you following the webinar. So we are there with the poll, so I'll close the poll and I can share the results with you. So they should pop up on your screen now.
Quite overwhelming in terms of where that sits, which is quite interesting to see in terms of that. So probably no rose-tinted glasses on us at the moment in terms of
because I think, are we moving towards it or aren't we? So I think it's sort of really interesting that we've got an audience that don't think it's all over, which is really good. So we've, because we often talk to people who think that, oh, there is equality in the workplace, isn't there? There's legislation. Yeah. Anyway, I've got to show you next, which some what I like to sort of shocking statistics. Because I think if you get statistics in front of people, it actually really opens up their mind, and then they don't see the world as just, well, we've got lots of women in our workplace and we've got a female CEO, and there's lots of equality in our workplace. But when you look at it on a global level, it's really very interesting. The chart on the left-hand side of the screen is a chart that I got from, it's McKinsey free subscription, so you get them and they're just fantastic. So because they give a true global perspective of what's happening on the world. And I love this one because it's the leadership funnel, and you can begin to see why women struggle so much to get into leadership positions. Now, I'm not going to talk about this too long because we're already overrunning, but there is something which they call the broken rung. And the broken rung on this leadership ladder is still holding women back. So for every 100 men promoted to manager, only 86 women are promoted. And then as a result, men outnumber women significantly at the manager level, which means that there are far fewer women to promote to higher levels. And so it goes on and on and on. So the broken rung is likely to explain why the representation of women at senior level is hardly improving. So it's very, very slow. And I think this, together with parenthood, which really exacerbates the problem. And interestingly, there are statistics that say that men who become parents find that their careers soar, but when women become parents, their careers at best plateau or at worst go backwards. So looking out for these statistics, I think, is really important, because then you've got something clearly that you can argue with. The one on the right is sort of, it's about the gender pay gap. And I got this one just from the BBC. So there's lots of stuff that you can get out there normally. And I find this one really interesting in that actually the gender pay gap just hasn't changed. So the reporting from 2019 to 2020 and 2020 to 21 is hardly changed. There's been no shift. So shifting the dial is really, really hard. Now, it's been a difficult year because of the pandemic and because of furlough and everything else that has been going on. And we know that women have disproportionately suffered during this period of time. But I think what's interesting about this is sort of clearly shows how there is, the pay gap does exist. And it's quite complicated how it's worked out. So, you're probably more expert at it than me. But I think what's really interesting about this is it's the tool that highlights how we're progressing. And organisations need this data in order to make change. So organisations need to do it. It's not about just paying lip service to it. It's actually thinking, why is this happening? And what can we do to change it? What do we need to do? So, and I think, there's a quote here, the path forward is clear. Companies need to recognise and reward women leaders who are driving progress, and they need to do the deep cultural work required to create a workplace where all women feel valued. And I think it's a lot about business culture. Yeah, so you'll be going out to new careers. Think about the business culture you go in, how it is now and how you can change it. Got another poll.
And another poll, and thinking about those and the promotion of women to leadership, one of the things we've done here is to ask you about leadership skills and which do you think are more feminine traits and which do you think are more masculine traits, or which do you think are neither? And these are the first three from there. So communication, drive, intuition. So Paul, I'm sure you'll be, you've pulled this up kindly for us.
Yeah, so the poll's open. So as soon as I saw the slide, I got it open for the audience to answer. Obviously, there is a few questions in there to have them answer. So we've got the results coming in. So we're around 50% of the audience has answered. So we'll just keep it open for a few more moments. And I think obviously it's a good time to remind everyone to let them know that the session is being recorded, and the recording will be with everyone a week from today. And obviously you'll receive an email where you can obviously get the slides and obviously view the recording. So we're at 80% of everyone voted. So we'll give it a few more seconds for everyone else to just finish answering. And then I'll be able to pass over the results to you guys. So here we go. So they should pop up on your screen now.
So communications as more feminine than masculine, but actually neither nor is the top score of that. The fact that drive comes across as is quite masculine in terms of where that is. And there must be the third one somewhere, Paul, which, oh, hang on. Do I have to do that? Or
yeah, you'll just have to scroll down.
I'll have to scroll down. So intuition comes across as more feminine. Creative problem solving is neither. And team building is neither, is the largest, but feminine if you were to push within that. What is quite interesting is we ask quite a lot of these questions of the women and men that we talk to. And one of the first things, and you didn't get the chance, I must admit, was a lot of them didn't like the fact that we were trying to ascribe them to either female or male in the first place, which is probably your neither nor. However, there are certainly historical ones there that come across, and there are ones that really came across as being talked about by women as things they felt they were very good at doing in terms of it. And as I think the results show, communication is generally felt to be a good feminine trait. Probably we should have used little f's. It doesn't mean that it's only present in them, but they felt it was very good. Drive was felt to be a very masculine trait and something that was often criticized that we didn't have, despite lots of examples of it. Intuition is a really interesting phrase where there's a sort of slightly damning version of it in terms of, oh, it's just a woman's intuition. What is interesting is how many of the current leadership texts are now talking about the value of intuition, of feelings, and actually being able to understand those and use those. And again, came across when the people we talked to as being a very feminine trait. Creative problem solving is an interesting one because I think it is more balanced and talked about differently. Katy was talking about the numbers. It is one of those ones where certainly some of the interviews we did, the women would talk about actually having a feeling or an intuition or an understanding or a sort of just a leap to going, that feels right, and then would want the information, the data to support it, while men would often work up from, oh, well, show me the statistics and I'll get to the results in the end, which is interesting about those statistics that Katy's just been through. Team building, as you had said as well, came across as something that a lot of women said, but I would say it's an interesting one because we found a number of men who did. It's a really interesting one that where you ask, what I would say is a lot of the great leaders I've spoken to, is you ask them what they are most proud of. and men will often default to an event and a business achievement, whereas women and some of the, I would go more rounded, fully rounded men will often talk about actually the thing they are most proud of are the teams they've built and what will then carry on into the future without them and the people that they have worked with and seen and helped grow, but have also learnt from. And so it's a really interesting one. And analytical decision making is something that is quite often more ascribed to men than women. So very much, I think, in keeping with the poll results. But it is interesting that these flow and ebb of what is seen of what's going to be the necessary attributes that you want as a future leader are in ebb and flow at the moment, and the old labeling of female and male to them is being challenged and is evolving over time.
Okay, right. We have got 9 minutes before we want to sort of get into the Q&A, so let's move on. One of the things which Giles and I felt really optimistic about when we were writing the book was how positive people were about the future. And the third section in the book, it really is our analysis of their stories and the interviews and actually what it means for the future world. And you are the future world. So, we feel that the future is actually really bright. There's some fascinating quotes here from women in the old world, which I think are amazing. And I think it still does happen nowadays. Despite leading the most profitable unit, when the promotions were announced, we were overlooked in favour of 2 underperforming men. And there was lots of things like that going on. But it does seem to be improving. Our feeling is that we're at a very exciting tipping point. So there's lots of things going on at the moment, and there's lots of people whose voices are being heard, which is really interesting. So, and the collective voice of women is emerging much more strongly and much more clearly. And many men are there working as allies to support the women and actually help them be successful in their careers or whatever they want to do. The other thing that's really interesting is there's a much greater understanding of the prejudices that exist and the unconscious bias. So, and calling people out for unconscious bias. So for example, even me myself, I have unconscious bias all of the time, and I get called out on it. And and I think that's such an important thing that's going on in the world that we need to really tackle. But what I think is really interesting, we now have the statistics that can change things and can drive change. And I did an interview recently with a guy called Phil Tyso, who works for Wipro on diversity and inclusion, and he's doing a lot of the data collection. And what he said, which was really interesting, was that previously there'd been lots of anecdotal pieces about the lack of equality, about men being promoted over women, about women being discriminated against because they had become mothers, for example. But actually, once you start to get into the numbers and you see the demonstrable gap, then you can start the conversation. So what Phil has found so powerful is he's been gathering the numbers. He's able to go to the board and say, look, these are the statistics, these are the numbers. What are we going to do to change this? And I think the more information that we have, the more data we have, then we're going to be able to make those changes that need to be implemented for the future. So we think it's really positive. Right, another poll, keep you active and engaged.
Yeah, but just picking up on some of the things we've done, and one of the quotes that Katy just talked about there was about one of the respondents we talked about, who, when she came back from the maternity leave, was actually, was so disgruntled with the job she was working, she had to go and look for another job. And ultimately what happened was she had to take a job down a rung from where she had been, which got us talking about what is it about parenthood that causes so many problems. And it is one of those still areas. And so the way we decided we might ask you the question is, what do you think will give you the stronger leadership skills? Doing an MBA or becoming a parent, or are they both equal?
So we've got the poll open. We're close to everyone answering, so we'll just give it a few more seconds for everyone to answer, and I'll be able to share the results with you both.
Mm-hmm.
Here we go. They should pop up on your screen now.
Which is quite interesting in terms of where that is. We had a debate, probably quite interestingly, both as parents. So that's interesting, and it's an interesting debating point, and it was one that we put to. Hang on, it sometimes takes a while to come back. We put to Sandy Griffiths, who was the lady who had to take the effective demotion on returning to work. And one of the things she talked about was just how undervalued in a business sense and what becoming a parent can teach you and how that can be really useful in a business sense. And she talked about building resilience in terms of that and understanding about working with no handbook or playbook, that there isn't such a thing as a perfect parent, there isn't such a thing as a perfect answer. And when you draw the parallels of that with modern business, she said it is so important that you get that understanding, that ability to keep going, that ability to keep trying, and not expect there to be perfect answers, not expecting things to go to plan, being able to carry on, being able to adapt was so important. Sandy, even before she had had her child, Courtney, actually talked about, she felt that she had quite a lot of empathy, but she said it sort of grew exponentially with that. She really had to understand and be able to intuit what her daughter was thinking, and actually that ability to be patient, to tolerant, to listen, to dig a little deeper, not to lose your temper when you're being asked why for the 75th time in a row. All of those sorts of things have to do. And again, she said that understanding of trying to listen to people and getting the empathy with them has helped her enormously. And then the idea of being a role model and saying, actually, it's not, as unfortunately we parents sometimes do, why should you do it? Because I said so. No, that's not the way. It's actually do as I do. And it's actually much more important about what you do. So I can't give you a definitive answer to whether an MBA is better or worse, but there are certainly, we think anecdotally, an awful lot of indications that becoming a parent really does help you in a business sense. And actually the richness that brings to you as a person actually they will come over to you as a business person too.
Right. I'm just going to talk for 1 minute on this slide, then we're going to open up to Q&A. So, at the end of the book, we talk about the 4 Bs, our bright future. And these are some guidelines for you that are really important takeaways. So I think just being aware, so find out what's going on, but also be aware of your unconscious bias. So the conscious biases are easy to identify, unconscious ones are a bit more difficult. So really need to watch out for those. Be generous. I mean, it's about supporting people around you, mentoring, training, promoting, encouraging, highlight people's achievements. So certainly women, but men as well. So, don't forget the men. It's really important. We're wanting to try to get to an equitable future. So for both men and women, we're not trying to have one in competition against the other. be really open-minded about career paths that don't fit the norm. So, historically, it's about going up the career ladder. There's a great book called Squiggly Careers, and it's sort of moving in and out and going off in different directions. And that's a benefit because it increases your learning, it increases your diversity of thinking. So be open-minded about different career paths. And finally, be brave, be willing to change yourself. And the way that you think, don't be entrenched in your ideas, encourage others to change, challenge them. So, I've really learned how to do this through writing this book because I've got the information that backs up my arguments, but drive change throughout the business and drive change throughout the businesses that you join. So if the culture is not right, as I was saying a moment ago, don't accept it. Either think about changing it if you can, or go to somewhere where the culture is fantastic. So, and the ideal future really blends both female and male characteristics. So gender balanced teams, working together, being successful together, and also embracing this cognitive diversity, the diversity of thinking. Right, I think we're going to hand it over to you to ask us lots of questions, hopefully.
Thanks, Katy and Giles. Great session. It was lovely to hear, obviously, all those different stories and really inspiring leaders. So thank you, obviously, for presenting today. Just before we move to some questions, just to remind the audience that obviously, if you do have any questions, keep these typed in to the Q&A tab. And obviously, if we do run out of time, don't worry, these get passed on to Katy and Giles to get in touch following the session. So I think we'll kick off with the first question. So the questions come in. It's saying research has shown that women feel they need to have all of the required experience before applying for new roles, whereas a man is happy with just 60%. I've seen this with myself and others. Therefore, how can we support women to be braver? So I don't know who would like to answer that one first.
I mean, I can kick off because Wendy, you're absolutely right. Every single one of the women that we interviewed talked about this. So it's absolutely fascinating that men seem to be and boys seem to be have this innate confidence, that they think that they're better than they are. So they'll say, "Oh yeah, I can do that. I can go out and do that." And sometimes they're believed. Other times they just don't have the qualifications that back that up. Whereas the women are actually much more hesitant about it. And I think what's really important in terms of supporting women is just convincing them that they do have the ability to do that. So we have in one of the interviews that we did, fortunately, it's a lady called Kate, and she had a great boss who really helped her through that. And she was wanting to apply for quite a high level job. She felt she was really stretching herself, but didn't feel that she had enough. But her boss really helped her through it. So they had such a good relationship. So it's thinking about, maybe I could do this, go with the 60% rule. I can't do the 10 out of 10 things that they want, but I can do 6 out of 10. And who can I go to help me to sort of overcome and convince them that I've got the ability to do this job? Because often you go into a job and you can't do it all in the first few weeks, months. It's something that you build upon. And it's good to have that challenge. So I would love to see more women challenging themselves and actually being braver. So just telling them this statistic actually helps, and then helping them to go for the job opportunities. Giles, anything to add?
I think the only things I would probably add, one was that we spoke to a managing director of an executive search firm, the headhunters, and he said that this is so bad that they are thinking about trying to develop new techniques for the first stage, for getting women to let them put their names forward, because this is a real struggle. And he says, he is seeing women who he thinks are as qualified, if not more qualified, and have as much potential as the male colleagues, But the issue that they've got is the male colleagues will say, oh yes, put my name forward. The women won't. So I would probably build on what Katy said. I think the idea of having role models and stories and success stories are important. I think the idea of trying to find a mentor or having mentors or having a really supportive boss is another one. And I think a lot of the people we spoke to had gone later in their careers, realized the importance of, having good female mentors to help them, and they've wanted to do that. So I would say I agree with the figure. I've seen it happen, and I've seen sort of really successful women almost having to be pushed forward to volunteer for something, and yet they've been so good at doing it when they've got there. So rather like Katy, I hope that starts to change and people are willing to move forward, because the men who are applying are not necessarily better than the women.
Excellent, thank you. So we'll move to the next question. So we talk about women inspiring women, but do you think there remains a stigma about men being inspired by women? Who would like to answer that one?
Not at all, actually. Lots of men that we have spoken to are inspired by women and have had great female bosses. So I've been doing some interviews with men recently, because for the book it was all women, and that was purposely so. But recently we've been doing more interviews with men to get their perspective, because one of the problems has been that men don't engage as much, even though they're big supporters. The men that I have spoken to, given they're allies, they're supportive of us, so they may be different from others, but they have actually said that part of the success of their career has been down to women that they have worked for and worked with. The women have been really inspirational leaders. So I think, there are a lot of men out there who really do appreciate the strengths and the abilities that women bring to the world of business. And believe they benefit from it. Giles, you may have a different perspective.
I think it's getting better. I think rather like when we set out to write this book, and we talked about, so if you were to talk about who's famous in advertising, you'd come up with a male name. If you were thinking about the people who wrote the famous marketing books, you came up with men. I think having, again, sort of role models who really stand out, who really are people that, when you say you admire them, you expect them, they are your heroes. To have women ones who are out there and are really doing that, I think are very important, and that they do it in fields where they haven't necessarily always done it before. So I think, some of the scientists on the vaccine and the work that they've done, I never get her name right because I never remember it, but Jacinda Ardern, or whatever it is, the name of the New Zealand Prime Minister, is another one who for me is just one of these ones who breaks through any potential negativity about those sorts of barriers. And I think the more of those that are out there, and the more celebrated they get, and the women who've done such fantastic things, which is part of the reason for the book, really do need shouting about still a little bit, because I think it's easy to nominate a man. Sometimes some men have to think a little harder before they'll nominate a woman.
Excellent, thank you. So we've had some more questions in, so I'm going to cut the question down because it's quite long, but the question's about obviously networks between men and women, and obviously they're talking about them being different. So the question's coming in saying that it's from a woman saying that she's really ambitious and she's wanting to succeed in her career, and obviously she's wanted to move ahead, but she's finding that there within the women's network there isn't that sort of drive, and obviously where she's looked at other sort of male networks that seems to be more regularly there, more closer with colleagues, they're looking to obviously upskill and obviously get better new jobs, and obviously finding sort of mentoring and sort of having that driven aspect. So the question is really saying, did you find this in your research as well? or have you found a different sort of answers to that?
Yeah, there's clearly differences between the way in which men network versus the way women want to network. So, there's lots of stories around women feel that they'd been disadvantaged because they didn't want to go down to the pub, or didn't want to play golf, or didn't want to go to the football because it didn't really interest them. So those traditional male networks, which unfortunately, they do still exist, and it's difficult for women to break into those. And then you've got sort of women's networks, and it seems ridiculous that we're dividing the genders through networking. So, and I still don't think there are networks out there which sort of combine both genders, which I think is a bit of a shame, or ways of networking that do that. So we did come across some, good female networks, though, and networking that were recommended. And I think one in particular which stands out for us, and we did a story on the lady who set it up. There's one called the Copy Club. And it's specifically for marketing, however, but it's really interesting in that there's lots of people that join up, and there's lots of training, and there's lots of mentoring, and so and they do have like breakfast meetings and things like that, but you can choose how you want to engage. It's not about going down to the pub or going to the football. It's about doing it in different ways. So breakfast meetings before work, online learning sessions and things like that. And women do want to network in a different way, and I think we need to develop more networks to enable them to do that, and to enable them to network with other men as well. So I still think it's a problem that needs to be solved. Giles?
Yeah, I agree with all you said. My take is possibly that I think within the question, there was a question that the person had asked about, satisfying and getting the right sort of encouragement for someone who was very ambitious, and where did she fit? And I think that's this idea of cognitive diversity and a better understanding and acceptance of that actually, if you think about female and male characteristics, actually they aren't unique to one sex or the other. It's actually, what sort of personality are you? And actually the richness and diversity of that personality is often quite good. So I would say for her, it's find somewhere you are comfortable and gives you the encouragement, the drive, the stimulation that you are looking for. And whether it's mostly male or female, doesn't matter. Find where the sort of people are giving you the drive, the questions, the stimulation that you need to succeed. And I think that's part of true equality, is that actually, as Katy has said, it's not about male or female, it's about where do you want to fit in and what suits you and the way you want to work.
Excellent, thank you. So I think we might have time for two quick questions. So we've got another question which has come in, which is, it came in actually off the back of the last poll around obviously doing an MBA, parenthood and stuff like that. So they're saying it's almost like a response, but a question at the same time. So maybe you might be able to give some tips and advice. So they're saying part of the problem is the assumption that all women have children, will have children that will impact their careers in a more dynamic way than men. Not all women become mothers. So what happens to women's careers then? So I don't know if you want to offer some guidance, some tips. So I'll pass over to you first, Katy.
Yeah, and that sort of goes through to conscious bias versus unconscious bias. So, when women actually have children, then there's often this conscious bias going on. But actually, not all women want to have children, or are going to have children. But there's this underlying feeling that, oh my God, she might get pregnant one day, and then what will that mean for the business? And it goes back to something that I'm really conscious of when I speak now, because I don't talk about motherhood anymore. I talk about parenthood, because having a child is a joint responsibility. And what we need to do is get everybody thinking differently. I mean, I know that's a mammoth job, so it's huge, but in the organization that you're working in, if you can get people to think about parenthood rather than motherhood, and parenthood being a joint responsibility, then that changes the whole narrative around that. Because I think what's happening in response specifically to this question, that just because you're a woman, you don't want to have kids, but there's an unconscious bias going on, just because you're a woman. So I think what we need to do is deal with all of the issues around parenthood and ensure that there's much more equality, and that people take parental leave, both genders take parental leave, that both genders are responsible for what's going on at home. And then if we can change that, it's a massive shift, then we might be able to change some of the unconscious bias that's happening against women who don't want to have kids.
I suppose my take on it is possibly unlike Katy. As you can see, we agree to disagree sometimes. I would probably still refer to motherhood, not because I don't think we should talk about parenthood, but so many of the statistics are around the difficulties of being a mother. So there is a slight point of difference there, which I'll come back to. But I think your other point is exactly right, is yes, the question did assume that whoever we were talking to was going to have a child and was going to become a parent. And certainly that was there probably more for effect than to say that we don't actually, that there is not a recognition that women or men have to have children. They may well choose not to, and they may well be happier for that and better for doing that. And as uncles, aunts, friends of people with children, they can learn some of those things that we talked about there. But I'm still a great believer at the moment that there was another book, I think, that we were talking about, which is, it was saying it's not about glass ceilings. What keeps women down are sticky floors. And it is this notion that women are still disproportionately having to do the two roles. They are still doing so much more work in the home than men are doing. It's getting better, but it's still a long, long way to go if you take the average across all of the things. So I take your challenge. We did that deliberately and to provoke, but I do think there is still major challenges going forward for women who do choose to have children, for the extra pressure that puts on them going forward. And part of that is the bias that business people think they've missed a year rather than they've gained something different by having becoming parents.
Yeah, the book that Giles is referring to is called The Home Stretch by Sally Howard. So great book, amazing statistics in the book, if anybody wants to read it. We got one more's popped up. Or is it just a response? Yeah.
Yeah, so it's saying what I find as a woman is that we are judged to be ready to have children immediately, or are already having children when we go to interview. So we'll see they're talking on the back of that. And we've just come another one built on the back of that. But in the work arena, if you don't have children, you're expected to work later whenever it's required. Do you find that?
Yeah, and that's wrong. It's so unfair. So we need to, and that's why businesses sort of need to set themselves up, to be able to look after and give every opportunity to all of their employees. So we're not saying that parents should have preferential treatment in terms of leaving early. Yeah, they have to, because they have to pick the kids up from nursery. But we need to, as managers, as team leaders, as leaders, we need to set things up, because it's really unfair if somebody else has to pick up the work. And I've heard that quite a lot. And that's not the right way to go about doing things. There shouldn't be an assumption that somebody would pick up a parent's work because of it. And that's about how you organise the workplace and how you organise what's been done. A lot of parents we talk to will say, they have to leave at 5 o'clock to pick up kids from nursery, but they'll pick up work again at 8 o'clock in the evening. a lot of parents will work flexibly. So it's sort of working with that. But, you know, if you're encountering anything like that, fight back, you know, because that's a different form of discrimination. So, and, you know, you need to fight for your equal rights as well. So, yeah, I'm very pro. I mean, Giles and I are both very pro people making the choices that they want to make. And there are lots of women who, you know, don't want to become mothers. And they want to forge ahead with their careers, and they shouldn't be held back just because they're women and just because people assume that they're going to. But actually, women who do want to have children, neither should they be held back either. So, you know, we're wanting to build a better, more equitable future. And there's a massive amount of work that needs to be done, because you can see from the statistics. But you know, if you can just keep on chipping away at the edges and actually just saying, well, hang on a minute, is this right? You know, or is this the way that we really want to work? You know, or is this the culture that I'm working in? Then you can start to change things, and it'll be slow. Yeah, as you know, I started out my career in the 1980s, and I'm still surprised at how little we've moved on. Yeah, but I do think we're at a tipping point and things are accelerating. So let's put our foot on the gas and let's move it forward faster. Is my view.
Excellent, thank you. So obviously, unfortunately, we've run out of time. I think we could just keep going on and on. It's been a great topic. Lovely to hear your answers, hear your inspiring stories. And just before we do go, just to let everyone know that if you do have any questions, keep typing them in. We will pass these over to Katy and Giles so they can get in touch with you directly. Today's session has been recorded, and the recording will be sent to you all via email a week from today. So please keep an eye out for that email to come to your inboxes. And obviously, just to say lastly, our next session is taking place on the 25th of January 2022. And obviously that's with Jens Schadendorf, and he'll be presenting on game changes at work, how the LGBT plus community and their allies are changing the global economy. So if you would like to sign up for that webinar, please head over to our website, www.associationofmbas.com, to fill out the online registration form. And obviously you can see all our scheduled webinars for obviously the back end of this year and obviously for next year. So lastly, what's all left to say is thank you, Giles and Katy, for taking the time out and presenting a great session. And we look forward to seeing everyone at the next webinar. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.